land of Josh Hasten here, Israel Uncensored, on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com. It is Sunday, May the 6th, 2018, the 21st of ER 5778. Hope you're doing well in your part of the world. Always get in touch with me. Josh at thelandofisrael.com is my email. On Facebook, it's Joshua Hasten, and on Twitter at Josh Hasten. And, of course, as usual, a lot going on in the world of Israel and news, and we're going to get right to it, because we're going to have a very, very special guest on the show. He's been on before, and who else to turn to with everything else going on here in Israel and the Middle East other than Dan Diker, the project director, program to counter political warfare at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And he's been a guest on, the last time he was on, it was actually raining, and it's still raining here in Israel. It's unbelievable. It's May. So wild. Unfortunately, last week's show, of course, we dedicated the show, if you missed it, to the victims of that flash flood in southern Israel. And we'll have to ask a rabbinical authority if the rain that is falling today in Israel, if it's a blessing or a curse. I don't know. Last week it was certainly no blessing. But we're going to get to the situation in Iran. So first of all, I want to welcome Dan Diker back to Israel Uncensored here on the Land of Israel Network.
Good to be back, Josh. Delighted to be on the show, and hello to all the listeners of Land of Israel Network.
So we're going to get right to it. Last week, the Prime Minister of Israel delivered a presentation live in front of the world. It was covered on all the major news networks. He spoke in English, talking about Iran and how our intelligence, our Mossad, somehow got hundreds and hundreds and thousands, really, of pages of information. And you saw the CD-ROMs documenting the Iranian nuclear program, which existed at some point in recent history, and after that, I think it was a masterful performance by the Prime Minister. Whether you like him or don't like him, I think he was truly in his element, speaking in English to the world. And after the fact, pundits all over were questioning whether the Prime Minister actually introduced something new, or if this was just old information and he was recycling it. The Jerusalem Post today talks about European intelligence teams visiting Israel this weekend, examining the files that the Prime Minister displayed, obtained by the Mossad in the raid in Tehran earlier this year, with the documents talking about the development of nuclear weapons. So my first question here to Dan Diker is, did, in fact, the Prime Minister introduce something new? Or, as several, if not many, media outlets and pundits are insisting on, saying that this is just old information and he's recycling it, and the Iranians are still upholding the letter of the 2015 agreement. Which is it? Is this new, or is this recycled information?
Well, Josh, it really is new, and in fact, our listeners can depend on the statements of the former deputy director of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Ali Henoman, who said very clearly, this is a jackpot, quote unquote. What is new is that the Prime Minister revealed that, first of all, the Iranian regime has been lying outright for years that they didn't have a secret nuclear weapons development program, which they have, and that the intention of the Iranian regime was actually to develop a very 5-10 kiloton nuclear weapons, which has not been revealed before, and in fact, it was Secretary of State Pompeo, Mike Pompeo, who was the former head of the CIA, today the Secretary of State of the United States, who said there is a lot of good and important new information that has been revealed. There are a number of political reasons that people would accuse the Prime Minister of not revealing things that are new, and that basically comes down to what the debate in Israel. And it is a debate because this is Israel Uncensored, your show, and therefore it's our responsibility to share with your listeners, Josh, that there is a debate in Israel over the tactics that the Prime Minister used, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, in order to reveal this new information in what is known as one of the most stunning intelligence operations since 1976 in the Entebbe raid on Uganda to free those passengers.
Now, the timing of the release of this information, again, you're right, there is a debate whether he should have kept it quiet, whether he should have released it to the world. Some are saying, and many are saying, that the timing is actually because of this deadline that the U.S. And President Donald Trump have, May 12th, the deadline set by the administration to come up with either the fix the deal or nix the deal on the Iranian agreement. What will President Trump do? So, number one, some are saying that the Prime Minister actually revealed this information several months ago to President Trump and now to the world just in time in order, in case President Trump was wavering, he's basically, our Prime Minister is saying it's time to nix the deal, and here's the proof, and the proof is in the pudding. Now it's in your court. You subscribe to that this is all about timing.
It very much is about timing. Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly wants to scuttle this deal. Israeli diplomats have come up with the term "nix it," "fix it," or "nix it" regarding the JCPOA, which, according to consensus opinion, Josh, in Israel, is a terrible agreement. There are very few that believe it's a solid agreement. However, there are 2 points of view on Netanyahu's expose here. One is that the Prime Minister should have done it privately. He should have gone to each one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council of the United Nations plus Germany and presented this intelligence information to them individually. That would have given them more room, in a little bit more wiggle room, in order to perhaps stake out a position against Iran that would be more comfortable for each one of the members of the Security Council plus Germany. And then there's another position that says, no, the Prime Minister's theatrical performance, ripping curtains, revealing in Hollywood style all of these CDs and all of these notebooks with this damning evidence against the Iranian regime's nuclear file, is very important in order to maximize the embarrassment of the Iranian regime publicly throughout the world at one particular time. That's to embarrass them and to frighten them. That the message being publicly that Israel can get anywhere, we can get any information at any time, and you cannot lie to not only to the Israeli people but to the world at large, and that it was Israel's, he felt, responsibility in order to basically set off a political nuclear bomb, if you will, that would reverberate throughout the world.
At the same time here, the J-Post reports that an official from Russia out of Moscow is threatening that if, in fact, President Trump nixes the deal, Moscow and Tehran will grow even closer. That, of course, we know that the Russians are now embedded in the conflict in Syria, siding with the Assad regime in that country, in that conflict, which has claimed over 500,000 lives over the last several years. So according to this Russian official, warning on Saturday reported by the J-Post, should President Trump take action, nix the deal, Russia's threatening, well, you're only going to draw us closer to the Iranians. If you can, comment on that, and if you can, maybe comment also on what you think the president may or may not do as a result of this threat. I mean, he seems like he's not one to take threats, and he's more of the one usually doing the threatening. What's your take on the Russians as vis-a-vis this threat that they just issued to the president?
Well, the Russians have a very serious terror problem at home. There are thousands of terror operatives, Sunni terror operatives in the Moscow area alone. And therefore, the Russian Federation, headed by Vladimir Putin, has put all of its eggs in the Shiite basket in order to keep its Sunni terror operatives in its own home at bay. It's a very risky strategy, and in fact, there is a lot of pressure coming upon President Donald J. Trump from Iran itself in the last hours before our discussion here on Land of Israel. network, Josh, and that is that the Iranians and in a sense the Russians are basically warning against all-out chaos if the United States scuttles the deal, which the United States and Israel both generally are in favor of, because the JCPA is such a dangerous deal, is such a dangerous arrangement, because it actually legitimizes Iran, and it basically protects Iran in a certain way as it continues to develop ballistic missile systems, as it continues to develop ways of retrofitting a nuclear warhead on these missiles, and as a way of giving them sort of a 10-year countdown to an internationally sanctioned nuclear military program. Now, the other way of looking at this is that and this is Israel, this is really largely the Prime Minister's position, that to nix the deal would mean to ratchet up the sanctions on the Iranian regime and to cause a downward spiral of the Iranian currency, the rial. Now, if you look at the Iranian currency has already began to spiral downwards out of control, and the Prime Minister and many in Israel believe that the Iranian people, who are mostly Western-oriented people who hate the regime, will once again, for the third time in recent memory, operate and attempt to overthrow or certainly to demonstrate with a great sense of energy and direction against the regime. This is the hope that ratcheting up sanctions once again will put the Iranian regime in an impossible position and lead to an outcome that is more favorable to Israel's demand to end, to really put a full stop. The Iranians, of course, are threatening war, and therefore this creates a lot of fear, especially among the European nations that are really moving and militating towards trying to keep the deal in place, as British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has actually come to the United States in an attempt to convince President Trump to keep the deal in place, following Emmanuel Macron, President of France's efforts to do the same. So it's a very, very high-risk game, Josh, one way or the other.
I'm glad you brought that up, mentioning the British and the French as well, because at the same time you have someone who is not in a position of power. He's not part of the U.S. administration. Former Secretary of State John Kerry reported in the Boston Globe, his hometown paper, over the weekend, claiming that Kerry himself has been meeting on his own with the Iranians, with Foreign Minister Zarif, which, according to some, would actually be illegal against the law because he does not hold a position of power. He's acting against the current position of the U.S. administration. And, I mean, he is a has-been, and I have no problem saying that and calling him out for all the years of mistreatment against Israel, in my opinion. But here you have the former Secretary of State sticking his nose into this Iranian situation, perhaps illegally, and meeting with the Iranians and trying to keep this agreement going. What can you say from what you've heard about the moves by former Secretary of State Kerry in regard to his sticking his nose where it doesn't belong in the current administration's business?
Well, the first problem with former Secretary Kerry is that he is doing exactly what Jared Kushner is being accused of in the interim period between Donald Trump's victory on November 4th, 2016, and then when he took office in January 17, which was to engage foreign powers in essentially, as you put it, intervening directly in the affairs of the United States on behalf of the United States. He can claim that he's acting only as an individual, but he's meeting with officials of the Iranian regime. It's very, very problematic. Obviously, Secretary Kerry, who negotiated a terrible deal, very dangerous deal for the West, is trying to save his own what's left of his own professional honor, as a former diplomat, and it's just extremely problematic. what he's doing. And this is exactly, by the way, what creates a weaker Western response, is when you have this type of split, of chasm. And you have the former, I don't even remember a time actually where former senior officials would actually interfere with the current U.S. government in trying to intervene with what is essentially the world's #1 supporter and director of international terrorism, as Mr. Kerry has done. But anyway, there are no surprises. We shouldn't be surprised, that these things are taking place.
Yeah, I'll never forget when John Kerry was Secretary of State, when Israel was fighting in Gaza in 2014, and he was mic'd up, ready to do an interview, and he didn't realize that he was actually being recorded, and he was criticizing essentially the Israelis, how he kept saying, yeah, it's a pinpoint operation in Gaza, it's a pinpoint operation, and we all know what great length the IDF in Israel goes to avoid civilian casualties, much more so than even the United States. And you could ask Colonel Richard Kemp, former British commander in Afghanistan, how he knows that the IDF is the most humane and moral army in the world, and how Israel always keeps civilian casualties to a minimum. I'll never forget that TV interview, or that mistake that he made without knowing that he was being recorded in 2014. But speaking of Gaza, at the same time all this is going on, we know Iran has tentacles throughout the Middle East, as our government often says, whether it's through Hezbollah in the north, via Syria and Lebanon, but also Iran being a backer of Hamas down in Gaza. And we've seen now, I think it's the 5th week in a row, we have these so-called protesters, I call them terrorists, who have been trying to infiltrate the border between Gaza and Israel. At the same time, they're flying these firebomb kites over into our territory, causing fires in the fields. They're also trying to themselves infiltrate, cross into the border, and we all know that Israeli communities, border communities on Gaza, could be in serious threat. I'm talking about, God forbid, attacks could be happening. If the IDF would go home, there would be attacks against Israeli civilians, women and children in these communities. So the IDF has been responding accordingly for the last 5 Fridays in a row, and I think there's going to be another one this week. And this is another tentacle of Iran. I want you to comment now on the situation. We've been focusing on Iran directly, but on this tentacle that they have down in southern Israel in Gaza.
Actually, it's very important, Josh, that you mentioned that the Gaza situation reflects another tentacle of Iran. It's very much that. Most reporting and analysis has missed this strategic point. But in fact, what is happening in Gaza, which is a combination of political warfare, of non-military warfare, combined with terrorism at the doors of the Hamas, is very much the brainchild of Qasem Soleimani, who is the Iranian commander of the Quds Force, which is in charge of all of their foreign terror operations. And according to reports, Qasem Soleimani met with the Hamas leadership in November and December and prepared them for this combination of political warfare and actual terrorism, because the thinking was, after 3 failed attempts to overcome the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza, 2009-10, 2012-2014, the Iranians were telling their their beneficiaries in Gaza, the Hamas, that they have to develop a new strategy, which is a combination of this political warfare, in order to re-engage the international community, to draw sympathy from the international community under the guise of some sort of innocent, peaceful protest. I don't know who can possibly imagine peaceful protests of bringing tens of thousands of people to try to storm a border fence. But at the same time, they're actually presenting posters, oversized posters of Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, in order to try to make their point of peaceful declarations, and to try to convince the international community that they're trying to get out of a situation of acute economic attack and poverty and so on. When in fact the whole substructure of their protest is the return of Palestinians into Israel, when they have their own de facto country, state, which is called the Gaza Strip. That's what the Oslo peace process was all about. So what they're doing is destroying Oslo, but they're getting credit for being some sort of peaceful purveyors of peaceful protests, which is absolute nonsense. But it shows you the effectiveness in today's world of high technology and social networks, that terror organizations can sort of refashion themselves and hide themselves behind black smoke and try to convince the world that they are engaging in peaceful protests, and actually draw Israeli fire by sending children and women to the front lines, paying them to sacrifice their lives and try to breach at the same time the security fence. It's a very problematic, it's a hybrid type of terrorism, hybrid warfare that Israel is having to deal with on the southern front, but it is very much the brainchild of the Iranian regime.
Yeah, they're so impoverished that over the weekend they destroyed the border crossing. I think it was Kerem Shalom, the border crossing where Israel supplies Gaza with
550 trucks a day.
550 trucks a day of humanitarian goods and aid. And yet these characters, I'm laughing now, but terrorists decided that they're going to destroy the point of entry there, where Israel's supplying them aid. In my opinion, I think that Israel should close off that area. I mean, eventually, I think Israel should reestablish Gush Katif. My listeners know that. But in the interim, I would say shut it off entirely. They're obviously unappreciative. We've seen time and time again they've tried to smuggle in weapons and using the materials that Israel provides them for humanitarian purposes, and Hamas diverting those to build their terror tunnels and their rockets. I say just shut them down once and for all and stop with this aid, because it's not, in my opinion, it's not winning over world opinion. No matter how many trucks we send over there, let them count on the Egyptians, rely on the Egyptians for their health and their humanitarian needs, and just completely shut them off. The media is, as you mentioned, down in Gaza, the media is falling for the situation where they're comparing themselves to Martin Luther King, and I saw them, they painted themselves blue. They look like a bunch of Smurfs, or the Blue Man Group, I said. But they painted their faces blue like Avatar, all these types of references to, as if they were the underdogs and they were the ones who really were being oppressed and whatnot. I say just shut the gates and say bye-bye and not deal with them anymore. And as the IDF is doing, and please God protect our soldiers, continue to do so. You cross a border, you come within 300 meters, whatever the IDF says, you're going to get a bullet. And that's the way that's the way it would be in any other country in the world, and should be the same for Israel. And we shouldn't have to worry about, unfortunately we are, but we shouldn't have to worry about this world condemnation against us, because they're turning against us, even with the trucks of aid, and even with everything we're doing, shooting people in the legs to minimize casualties. It's not helping. I say to shut them off once and for all. I mean, what would you do in this situation?
I think shutting them, when we say shut them off, we mean close the border.
Oh, absolutely.
That is what Israel was to have done back in 2005, when Israel pulled out unilaterally from the Gush Katif area and the rest of, we had
northern Gaza.
We had 21 Jewish communities in the Gaza Strip, and we obviously forcefully pulled 10,000 tax-paying citizens out of Gaza and all of our military installations out of Gaza. The mistake that we made, Josh, that you're pointing to now, is that we agreed to continue supplying infrastructure, utilities, electricity, water, and other basic forms of assistance to the Gaza Strip, when in fact Israel should have pulled out completely and shut all of the supply lines into Gaza, because in one sense we're forced to supply Gaza for humanitarian reasons with all this infrastructure and utilities. At the same time, we get no credit for it. In fact, they're using it against us when we unilaterally pulled out and destroyed the lives of 10,000 people for the sake of security, for the sake of peace. So it's a major problem, and I think your suggestion is the right one. If they want to be independent, which they say they do, and they want nothing to do with Israel, and they kill Israelis and they boycott Israelis, so then they don't get water and they don't get electricity, they get nothing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, in my opinion, I think we're being too humane, because if we're willing to take that risk when turning over aid to Hamas, essentially, or money and supplies and materials which are going to end up in Hamas's hands, knowing that they're going to use them against our population centers and we promote the fact that we turn over all these trucks worth of goods, I don't think that's humane at all, because we're putting our own people at risk. I think it's taking a big chance, and I think we should shut the border. We're nearly out of time here. This is a pretty historic week coming up in the next 10 days or so. I mean, we have the U.S. Embassy moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the big ceremony next week. I think Guatemala already essentially moved their embassy. And we still have Hamas saying, I think that this coming Friday, if not the next one, who can keep track with all their threats and whatnot, is going to be supposed to be the huge, what they call the Nakba, supposed to be a huge protest. What do you think is going to happen? I know you're not a prophet, as great as your analysis has been today, Dan. You're not a prophet, but we are going to have these major events, May 14th, the anniversary on the English calendar of the establishment of the State of Israel, what they call the Nakba, and the embassy moving, and perhaps another week or two of protests along the Gaza border. What can we expect in the country other than this crazy rain we're having? What else do you see going on? And then afterwards, unfortunately, we're nearly out of time.
It's a very historic month, the month of May. Israel, on the Gregorian calendar, Israel Independence Day, we have probably the President of the United States will be coming to personally oversee the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and senior American officials. And then we have the next day, what they call Nakba Day, which is the day of what the Arabs call the disaster, the catastrophe. Meaning, I'm not quite sure what they're crying about, because the Arabs that live in Israel with Israeli citizenship are actually the most privileged and prosperous, profitable community in the entire Middle East, in the entire Arab Middle East. So actually, the Arabs have only done well. Those who live in the Palestinian Authority actually do a lot better than those Arabs in any other Arab country around the world, except for some of the Gulf states. So they really should be. It shouldn't be called the catastrophe. It should be called a celebration of success. But so we have that event, and oh my goodness gracious, all kinds of protests that are planned. It's a big. We have Yom Yerushalayim. We have Jerusalem Day coming up just around the corner. So it's a big month for the state of Israel. But then again, Josh, as our friends know in the United States, Israel was born having to defend itself in conflict. That is just the name of the game. That's what we have to live with, and we'll continue to celebrate on the one hand and defend ourselves on the other.
Yeah, it's pretty much been the same for the last 70 years, and it's been the same for the last, 100 years. We talk about our enemies' desire to annihilate us and throw us into the sea. It's been their stated goal. Nothing has really changed, but we're going to go on here wherever you are in the country and enjoy ourselves on Jerusalem Day and watch, because not too many people were invited, apparently, to the ceremony when the U.S. is moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Truly historic times, and we'll definitely want to have you back on the show, Dan, to keep us abreast of everything going on here in Israel and the Middle East. Dan Diker, Project Director, the Program to Counter Political Warfare at the JCPA, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. It's always an honor to have you on the program. Yom Yerushalayim Sameach. Have a wonderful Jerusalem Day, the day we liberated that city and the rest of Judea, Samaria, the Golan, and all the other areas which are now part of the modern miracle, which is the state of Israel. Glad to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Josh. Terrific.
And just make sure that if you want to comment on today's program, feel free. Josh@thelandofisrael.com is my email. Joshua Hasten on Facebook, at Josh Hasten on Twitter. And if you missed any part of the show, you can always catch us on SoundCloud, iTunes. You can always go back to thelandofisrael.com and see previous shows and listen to all the great shows from all the hosts here on the Land of Israel Network. Signing off, happy Jerusalem Day from a rainy, unbelievably rainy Gush Etzion, Israel. I'm Josh Hasten. Most importantly, between now and when we speak again next week, everyone out there in the wonderful world of ours, be safe. Shalom, shalom from Gush Etzion, Israel.
Israel was founded despite the Holocaust, not because of the Holocaust.
This week on Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman, an interview with Naftali Bennett, head of the Bayit Yehudi Party and Minister of Education.
It's not about the safe haven. It's about coming home.
Tune in to hear one of the most powerful people in the Israeli Knesset. That's Inside Israel Today with Gil Hoffman on the Land of Israel Network at thelandofisrael.com.
This is Naftali Bennett.